Rabbi Silverman, a member of the Commissioner's Interfaith Advisory Council, and Commissioner Gordon Ambach discussed the origin and purpose of the Interfaith Advisory Council statement of affirmation and support for public education by religious institutions with moderator Charles Touhey. The program was broadcast on Albany Cable Channel 16.
Recently, the Interfaith Advisory Council, appointed by the New York State Commissioner of Education, Gordon Ambach, issued a statement of affirmation and support of religious institutions for public education. On our last program, two endorsers of this statement, Bishop Howard Hubbard of the Albany Catholic Diocese and Reverend Robert Lamar, pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Albany, shared with us their thoughts on the importance of public education and the crucial role educators, spiritual leaders, and parents play in helping our children to achieve an understanding of moral, ethical, and spiritual values. To continue our discussion, we have with us this evening Gordon Ambach, Commissioner of Education of the State of New York, and Rabbi Martin Silverman of Albany's own Temple Beth Emeth, who is a member of the Commissioner's Advisory Council. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Hey, Charlie.
My first question, I believe, maybe to Rabbi, would be what were the origins of this statement from the Interfaith Advisory Council?
It began about a year ago at one of our regular quarterly meetings when the feeling was expressed by a number of people that there was a gap, at least in people's minds, between public and religious education. And all of us on the council were unanimous in our feeling that this was something that, the perception was something that we did not want to foster. And we wanted to indicate how we as representatives of religious groups could endorse public education in our state and the concept generally. So that a committee was formed, and they came back with a statement which was then ripped to pieces, of course, put back together again, and after a while this, I think, very beautiful statement was accepted not only by our council but also by the New York Board of Rabbis, the New York State Catholic Conference, and the New York State Council of Churches.
Thank you, Rabbi. Commissioner, your role in all of this?
The Interfaith Advisory Council is comprised of about 15 to 20 persons who represent the major faiths within the state of New York. This council has been in existence for several years. It provides for me and for my colleagues in the department and for the members of the Board of Regents an extremely important forum through which religious leaders are expressing their concerns about education and particularly about public education. I make that distinction because it's not a council which is focused itself on education which is religiously sponsored. Their concern always has been about the issue of the religious institutions and concerns for what was happening in public education. As Rabbi indicates, it was about a year ago that there was a sense of importance for the council to begin preparing the statement that we're talking about today. There is no precedent for this in New York, and I know of no precedent for such a statement anyplace else in the United States, where, in fact, representatives of the major faiths have come together to agree on this very concise but very powerful statement, very clear statement about the importance of public education in this country and the importance to the religious institutions of public education.
You mentioned that it became apparent that it was time to issue this. Was there any particular event that spurred this on, or was it a general feeling in the State Ed Department?
There was no particular event, and I do want to repeat something that Rabbi said. The initiative came from the Advisory Council, not from the department. It's, of course, a project that's had my very strong endorsement all the way through, but the initiative was from the members of the Advisory Council. I think that one readily sees today, and one did a year ago, many issues on which there might be divisions between public and non-public schools and the auspices, sponsors of public and non-public schools. Those are very sharp differences right at the moment on certain kinds of issues that are before the Congress, on funding issues. But indeed, there were such issues back a year ago and even before that time. And a feeling that what seemed to be issues as between the two sets of schools or their sponsorship shouldn't be permitted to be seen as issues which were between public schools and religious institutions. There are, after all, in our state, 17% of our children in non-public schools, 83% of the children are in public schools. These children are the children who are also within the religious institutions, those in the public schools, and they have, therefore, a very strong commitment to their children who are in the public schools. But it was a general feeling, not a single event or a specific event, that led to the development and then the issuance of the statement.
How does the statement interface with the existing private and parochial school systems?
Well, let's say what it's not. It's not a statement to the effect that public education is more important than education in non-public schools, nor the other way around.
Right.
There was not any attempt to try to draw a comparison as to which was more important. Indeed, I think it's an expression that education is important, and it is important that the religious institutions support it. But the statement does not really speak specifically to the issue of the role of religious institutions in providing education of religious nature, nor does it speak specifically to the importance of the maintenance of non-public schools.
If I might add
Yes.
something to what the Commissioner said earlier and also to this, I don't see that we, in drawing this up, were trying to, we certainly were not trying to put the two school systems on opposite ends of the pole. And in it we indicate that there's room for both. But recently this new report by Professor Coleman on religious education, religious schools and public schools has been handled in the press in such a way as to indicate that there is competition and that one is trying to outdo the other. And very possibly the fact that we have this statement here in New York will indicate that, at least in our state, we do not feel that this competition exists, that each of them have their own roles.
The public schools of necessity must be pluralistic. Bishop Hubbard and Bishop Hubbard and Reverend Lamar on our last program suggested some specific ways of dealing with the spirituality of school children. They talked of perhaps having courses in religion, survey courses in ethics and moral values. What would be your feeling of on those sort of things?
Well, it depends on what level they would be introduced, and it would also depend a great deal on the teacher preparation for this. I've had enough experience dealing with these things to know that it's a loaded type of subject, where you get a teacher who is strongly committed to a particular religious tradition. It takes a lot of training to teach that particular teacher how to handle a sensitive issue without bringing a particularistic idea into the teaching itself.
There's clearly a combined role here for the family, for the religious institution, the synagogue or the church, and for the school, and the overall development or nurturing of any child, and a division as to the responsibilities of which aspects are stressed principally in which of those settings. This statement is not particularly advocating that there be any kind of special courses or religious instruction within the schools. Indeed, of course, in New York, we have a lengthy history with respect to release time and the issue of formal religious instructions, how that should be done in particular settings, and what the limits are within the public schools. But I think that there is, of course, underpinning a very fundamental responsibility of the schools, which is in the development of the civic responsibility of any child, a very close traditional link between the spiritual and the moral values, which are religious values, and the very underpinnings of our democratic society and the rule of law. And I think it's principally on the issues of how one develops the civic responsibility, the self-discipline which in turn leads then to a sense of discipline which is essential in order to keep a society together. It's in that sense, and in the sense of our religious history, ethical history, that I think there is good ground for the incorporation within school programs, in the social studies, in the literature that's read, for an understanding of what those traditions are.
Picking up on that, I'd like to read a few sentences from the statement itself. Schools and other formal educational institutions are being called upon to accomplish more for more persons than ever before. These demands are at times reasonable, at times excessive. It is a task that we feel will be more difficult to achieve without the close cooperation and support between educational and religious communities. And we might have added there the homes also, because what this is saying to me is that we've thrown a lot of our problems at the schools, whether they be public or parochial, and expect them to do things which many parents, often for reasons beyond their control, were doing in another generation and cannot do or will not do today. And what we're saying here, it's not fair. Let's have some help.
Going back a bit to the school atmosphere itself, the commissioner mentioned the humanities in particular, which would be the reasonable forum for this inculcation of the values of both ethnic and spiritual values. How do you see the humanities being rejuvenated, or should they be taught in a different way? How can the teachers become more aware of this so that they can become reflective of the intent of this statement?
Well, that's a tough question right now. You have all sorts of teachers, and you have all sorts of teacher training institutions. And I think that the teacher, the individual teacher, of course, has to reflect his or her own background and his or her own education, so that what this statement is doing is putting out before those people who are sensitive to what we think the American way of life and democracy and education is all about, putting it in clear issues and taking away the idea that there is any kind of opposition between public education and religious education. We look upon this more as a complementary, two streams going in the same direction, but not fighting each other.
I'd like to take us back just a moment or two, though, to what is the principal purpose of this statement. And that is, in the simplest terms, as clear and direct a statement as could possibly be made about the importance of having our religious institutions say that public education in this society is absolutely essential, and that the resources that are necessary from the public in order to support public education must be forthcoming, and that persons who are of religious persuasion and affiliated with the various institutions that endorse this statement have a very particular obligation to support public education, both in the sense of their support of budgets and also to support public education in their own personal commitment, whether it be in service on school boards, whether it be service in parent organizations, and other kinds of advocacy groups, which are focused exactly on the issue of enough resource for a public education. Given our current circumstances with respect to very likely or proposed major changes at federal budgeting, difficulties in our state and at our local levels in New York with respect to the competition for resources, and the overall very severe fiscal concerns, this kind of statement has to be read in the sense of a priority and an importance for public education as coming from the religious institutions.
I'd like to summarize by saying that we can agree that ethical and moral values do have religious foundations, and the public educational process must find ways to recognize this influence. without disrupting the separation of church and state. It's important for each of us to become aware of our individual responsibilities for education of our children and to understand the attitudes, policies, and practices that affect public education. I'd like to invite comments from our viewing audience. You can write to me, Charles Touhey, at 53 Ramsey Place, Albany, New York, 12208.